The church was packed for my father's funeral. Jonathan Barrett had been a pillar of the community, building Barrett Construction from a small residential contractor into the largest commercial developer across 3 states. Everyone who mattered was there: business associates, politicians, family, and friends, all paying their respects to a man who had built a $75 million empire from nothing. I stood quietly near the casket, accepting condolences alongside my sister, Kate. We had both dropped everything to come home when Dad suffered his heart attack. Though we'd arrived too late to say goodbye. Kate had flown in from her surgical residency in Boston, and I had left my architectural firm in Chicago. We'd always been close, united by our grief after our mother died when we were teenagers. And now by the loss of our father. "How are you holding up, Rachel?" Kate whispered as another line of mourners passed by. "I'm managing," I said, though truthfully, I felt numb. Dad and I had always shared a special bond. I was the daughter who followed him into the construction world, not as a developer, but as an architect. We understood each other. Kate squeezed my hand as our cousin Michael approached, his wife Vanessa by his side. Michael was Uncle Robert's son, and he had worked at Barrett Construction since college, while Kate and I had forged our own paths. Michael had embedded himself deeply into the business, positioning himself as Dad's right hand. "Rachel, Kate," Michael said, embracing us with practiced sympathy. "Your father was like a second father to me. This is devastating for all of us." There was something slightly performative about his grief, and it made my skin crawl. But I pushed the feeling aside. This wasn't the moment to pick a fight. "Thank you for handling the arrangements," I said. Dad had passed away at the office, and Michael had taken charge of the logistics while Kate and I rushed home. "Of course," he replied, nodding solemnly. Jonathan would have expected nothing less. In fact, he had been preparing me to take on more responsibilities. We'd been discussing my eventual transition into the CEO position. I blinked. This was the first I'd heard of any succession plan involving Michael. Dad had always been tight-lipped about business strategy. But something like that? He would have told me, wouldn't he? "I'm sure we'll have time to discuss the company once we've had a chance to grieve," Kate said smoothly, always the diplomat. Michael's smile flickered. "Actually, there are matters that can't wait. I've scheduled a family meeting at the house after the reception. The lawyers will be present. Later that afternoon, after the burial, mourners gathered at my father's sprawling Victorian home on Lake Urive. The house Kate and I had grown up in was filled with people sharing catered food and stories about Dad. I moved through the rooms in a haze, accepting condolences, still trying to process that he was really gone. "Rachel," a familiar voice called out, pulling me from my thoughts. I turned to see Martin Chen, my father's longtime friend and the architect who had first inspired me to pursue the field. "Martin, thank you for coming," I said, hugging him. Tears stung my eyes again. "Jonathan was so proud of you," he said gently. "He told everyone about your firm in Chicago and all the awards you've won." I smiled through my tears. We were working on a project together. Actually, a community center downtown. Dad was providing the land and the financing, and I was designing it. Martin looked surprised. I hadn't heard about that. "We were keeping it quiet until the plans were finalized," I explained. "Dad wanted it to be his legacy project: affordable housing, community spaces, a medical clinic. We were going to break ground next spring." Before Martin could respond, Michael's voice echoed through the hallway, announcing that the family meeting would begin in Dad's study. I excused myself and made my way through the house, finding Kate already seated in one of the leather chairs opposite Dad's massive oak desk. Michael had positioned himself in Dad's chair, his wife Vanessa standing beside him. 2 men in suits, presumably the lawyers, stood nearby. "Now that we're all here," Michael began as I sat down, "we can address some urgent matters. As you know, Jonathan was the sole owner of Barrett Construction and its subsidiaries. With his unexpected passing, key decisions must be made to ensure business continuity." One of the lawyers stepped forward. "I'm James Wilson, corporate counsel for Barrett Construction. In the absence of a formally executed will—" "Wait," I interrupted. "What do you mean, absence of a will?" "Dad definitely had one. He updated it every few years." Michael cleared his throat. "Unfortunately, there was an accident last week. Jonathan had taken out his estate documents for review. There was a fire in the fireplace. A draft caught the papers." And the will was destroyed. I stared at him in disbelief. And there were no copies? Not with his lawyer? Not anywhere? Your father preferred to keep his personal matters private. Wilson explained. He kept the original in his home safe. We were scheduled to review it this coming week. Kate leaned forward, frowning. That doesn't make sense. Dad was meticulous about everything, especially legal matters. Grief can distort memory. Michael replied with rehearsed calm. The important thing now is to establish interim leadership. The second lawyer distributed folders. These are interim management agreements authorizing Michael to oversee all Barrett family business and estate assets until the probate process is complete. I opened the folder, reading quickly. It would give Michael total control over the company. The accounts, the properties, everything. And if we don't sign? Kate asked bluntly. Michael's smile tightened. Then we risk financial paralysis. Projects stall. Contracts are jeopardized. And the estate, your inheritance, could be severely impacted. I shut the folder. We'll need time to review this with our own lawyers. Of course, Michael said, ever the magnanimous cousin. But do keep in mind, delays may be costly. I looked at Kate, her jaw tight. Something wasn't right, and I intended to find out what it was. That evening, after the last of the mourners had left, Kate and I sat at the old kitchen table in the house where we'd grown up, trying to make sense of everything. The study meeting kept replaying in my mind, Michael's confidence, the unsigned documents, and the story about the will being accidentally destroyed by fire. There's no way Dad's will just happened to burn up right before he died. Kate said, echoing my thoughts. And there's no way he didn't have copies. I added, Michael is lying. Kate rubbed her temples. But why? Dad treated Michael like a son. He was already going to inherit something substantial. I leaned back in my chair, thinking about Michael's ambition, how he always acted like he was entitled to the company, how he'd maneuvered himself into Dad's inner circle. Maybe substantial wasn't enough for him. Maybe he wanted everything. What do we do? Kate asked. We can't prove anything. And without the will. I sat up, a thought striking me like a flash. Last month, Dad took me to the bank. He showed me his safe deposit box. Said I should know how to access it, just in case. Kate's eyes widened. You think the will could be there? I don't know, but it's worth checking. The next morning, we arrived at First National Bank just as it opened. The manager, recognizing us immediately, offered his condolences before escorting us to the vault area. Your father was one of our most valued clients, he said as he located the correct box. He maintained several accounts here and had this safe deposit box for over 30 years. He used his key, and I used the one Dad had given me. The box slid out with a metallic thud. My heart pounded as the manager discreetly stepped out, leaving us alone. Inside were several sealed envelopes, a leather portfolio, and a USB flash drive. The largest envelope was labeled, in Dad's distinctive handwriting, Last Will and Testament, copy. I knew it, Kate whispered, hands trembling. I opened the envelope. The will was detailed and unambiguous. Dad had left 30% of Barrett Construction to me, 30% to Kate, 20% to Michael, and the remaining 10% to a charitable foundation he had created in Mom's name. He had named me as CEO, citing my architectural background and vision. Kate was to serve on the board, even while continuing her medical career. The document was properly signed, dated, and witnessed. But that wasn't all. The leather portfolio contained the finalized plans for the community center I'd mentioned to Martin, affordable housing, public meeting spaces, and a medical clinic. There were property deeds, funding agreements, and architectural drawings, my own, neatly folded inside. Dad had already transferred the downtown land and $25 million in development funds into a separate LLC jointly owned by him and me. Kate flipped through another folder while I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. Dozens of files appeared, spreadsheets, scanned memos, and emails. My stomach tightened as I read through them. Michael's been funneling company funds into his own shell corporations, I said, voice low. He's been doing it for years, just enough to avoid raising suspicion. Kate looked over my shoulder. That's why he wanted control. It wasn't just about inheriting the company. He needed to cover his tracks. He didn't count on Dad leaving us this, I said, tapping the USB. Kate sat back, her face hard. So, what do we do now? I looked at the will in my hands. We go to Michael's meeting and bring some guests. That afternoon, the air was thick with tension as we walked back into Dad's study. Michael stood behind the desk, papers ready, clearly expecting our signatures. His wife, Vanessa, lingered beside him, wearing a carefully composed smile. "Have you made your decision?" Michael asked as we entered. "We have," I said calmly, "but before we sign anything, we'd like to introduce a few people." Right on cue, the door opened. Martin Chen stepped inside, followed by an elegant older woman I recognized immediately, Dad's personal attorney, Sophia Greenwood. Behind them were two board members from Barrett Construction. Michael's face paled slightly. "What is this?" "This," I said, placing the will on the desk, "is a copy of our father's actual will, the one you knew existed. The one he reviewed with senior executives last year." Color drained from Michael's face. "Where did you?" "Dad kept a backup in his safe deposit box," Kate answered coolly, "along with some very interesting records." Sophia stepped forward. "As Jonathan Barrett's attorney, I can confirm this is his most recent will. It's properly executed, and the original is in our firm's records." Michael's lawyer, Wilson, looked stunned. "I was told there was no will. That it was lost in a fire." "There was no fire," I said. "There was a lie. Michael tried to deceive us, and you, so he could seize control of everything our father built." "These are serious allegations," Michael began, his voice rising. "I was only trying to ensure business continuity." "By forging documents and attempting to defraud the rightful heirs?" Sophia asked sharply. "That's not continuity. That's criminal." Janet Forrest, one of the board members, stepped forward. "The board will need to convene immediately. Michael's actions constitute a breach of fiduciary duty." Michael's confidence was collapsing. "This is all a misunderstanding. I acted in the family's best interest." "And what about the money you diverted to Pinnacle Ventures?" I asked, referencing the documents from the USB. His mouth opened, but no words came. He was completely white. "Dad knew," Kate said softly. "That's why he showed Rachel the deposit box. He was preparing for this." As the room fell into stunned silence, I realized that our father hadn't just protected his company. He'd protected us. And now it was our turn to protect his legacy. Michael greeted us with barely concealed impatience as Kate and I stepped into Dad's study that afternoon. The same folders from yesterday sat neatly arranged on the desk, along with two pens lined up side by side, ready for our signatures. "Have you made your decision?" he asked, his voice clipped. "As I mentioned before, we have pressing matters requiring immediate attention." "We have," I replied calmly, "but before we sign anything, we'd like to introduce some people." The door behind us opened right on cue. Martin Chen walked in first, his presence composed but unmistakably firm. Behind him followed Sophia Greenwood, Dad's longtime personal attorney, dressed impeccably and holding a leather briefcase. Two members of the Barrett Construction Board entered last, their expressions neutral but alert. Michael's face stiffened. "What is this?" "This," I said, stepping forward and placing a document on the desk, "is our father's real will. The one you claimed had been destroyed. The one he reviewed with senior executives just last year." The room fell into stunned silence. Michael's complexion blanched. "Where did you find that?" "In his safe deposit box at First National Bank," Kate answered, arms folded across her chest. "The same box he showed Rachel last month. Just in case something happened." Sophia stepped forward, setting her briefcase on the table. "As Jonathan Barrett's personal attorney, I can confirm that this is his most recent, legally binding will. It was properly executed, witnessed, and filed. I also hold the official original copy at my firm." Michael's corporate attorney, James Wilson, looked blindsided. "I was told the documents were destroyed in a household accident. That there were no copies." "There was no accident," I said, staring directly at Michael. "There was deception. Michael lied to you. He lied to us. He tried to take control of the company by pretending the will was gone." Michael raised his hands in mock surrender, voice trembling just slightly. "Let's not overreact. I was trying to keep things moving. We're all grieving. I didn't want the company to stall. By distributing false documents and attempting to override the rightful heirs?" Sophia snapped. "That's not leadership. That's fraud." Board member Janet Forrest, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, stepped forward. "The board will need to address this immediately. This represents a serious breach of fiduciary duty." Michael looked around the room, searching for a lifeline. but found none. It was just a misunderstanding. I was only acting in the family's best interest. And the funds you funneled into Pinnacle Ventures? I asked, pulling a printed spreadsheet from the folder I brought. Were those in the family's best interest too? His eyes darted from the paper to my face. The silence said more than any excuse could. Dad knew, Kate said quietly. He didn't trust confrontation, but he trusted documentation. That's why he made sure we had access to everything. The USB drive had exposed far more than we had anticipated, paper trails of Michael's side dealings, unauthorized transfers, and even suspicious contracts linked to shell companies he secretly controlled. It hadn't been enough to bankrupt the company, but it was enough to paint a clear picture of his intentions. Michael's confidence completely unraveled. I think, Sophia said, turning to the board members, that it would be prudent to move forward with the formal execution of Mr. Barrett's will immediately. I agree, said the second board member, a tall man named Ellis Grant, and to schedule an emergency session to discuss Mr. Michael Barrett's removal from any leadership role. Effective immediately. Michael opened his mouth again but was cut off by a knock at the door. 2 security personnel, quietly summoned by the board earlier, stepped into the room. Michael Barrett and Vanessa Barrett. One of them said, "We've been asked to escort you from the property. You are no longer authorized to remain here." Vanessa's composure cracked. "This is ridiculous. You can't just." "Yes, we can," Janet replied coolly. "And we are." Michael turned toward me one last time. "This isn't over." "It is," I said, holding my father's will in my hand. "You just didn't see it coming." As Michael and Vanessa were removed, Sophia remained behind to begin the legal formalities. She collected signed statements, reviewed the will with the board, and ensured that everything was officially documented. When the dust settled, only Kate and I were left standing in the study. For the first time in days, I allowed myself to truly breathe. "I can't believe he'd do this," I whispered. "Dad trusted him." Kate put a hand on my shoulder. "He did, but he also prepared for the worst. That's why he left us everything we needed to stop it." I looked around the room that had once been Dad's sanctum, lined with books, plans, and years of blueprints. It felt like he was still in the room, watching, guiding. My eyes settled on the architectural plans Dad and I had developed together, the community center project that would serve as his final legacy. The downtown land was already in our name. The LLC was established. The funds were secure. "What are you going to do about the CEO position?" Kate asked, her voice soft but clear. "Dad named you, but your firm's in Chicago. You have your own life there." I ran my fingers across the drawings again. Memories rushing back, late night sketching designs, planning layouts, debating materials with Dad over dinner. This was more than a job. It was a calling. "I think it's time to come home," I said. "Dad built something meaningful here. He trusted me to carry it forward." Kate smiled, eyes glassy but proud. "Then let's build something worthy of him." Outside the window, the sun was beginning to set. The lake glowed golden, just like it had every summer of our childhood. A quiet resolve settled in me. This wasn't just about saving a company. It was about honoring the man who built it, and proving that his legacy was in the right hands. The church was packed for my father's funeral. Jonathan Barrett had been a pillar of the community, building Barrett Construction from a modest residential contractor into the largest commercial developer across 3 states. Everyone who mattered was there: business partners, politicians, family, friends. All gathered to pay their respects to a man who had created a $75 million empire from the ground up. I stood quietly near the casket, accepting condolences beside my sister, Kate. We had both dropped everything to come home when Dad had his heart attack. Though we'd arrived too late to say goodbye. Kate had flown in from her surgical residency in Boston, while I had left my architectural firm in Chicago. We'd always been close, especially after Mom died when we were teenagers, and now we were united again in loss. "How are you holding up, Rachel?" Kate whispered as a new group of mourners passed by. "I'm managing," I said, though inside I felt nothing. Numb. Dad and I had always shared a special connection. I was the daughter who followed him into the industry, not as a developer, but as an architect. It gave us common ground, a mutual understanding. Kate gave my hand a gentle squeeze as our cousin Michael approached. His wife, Vanessa, walked beside him. Michael was Uncle Robert's son and had worked at Barrett Construction since college. while Kate and I had pursued separate careers. Michael had climbed the corporate ladder under Dad's guidance, eventually positioning himself as Dad's right hand. Rachel, Kate, Michael pulled us into a hug, voice dripping with sympathy. Your father was like a second father to me. This is devastating for all of us. There was something a little too smooth about his tone, a polished sadness that didn't feel entirely sincere. Still, I pushed the thought aside. This wasn't the moment for suspicion. Thank you for handling everything, I said, since Dad's heart attack had happened at the office. Michael had coordinated the funeral arrangements while Kate and I were still traveling. Of course, Michael nodded gravely. Jonathan would have expected it. In fact, he and I had recently been discussing a transition. He was preparing me to step into a larger role. We talked about me becoming CEO. I blinked. That was the first I'd heard of any plan for Michael to take over. Dad had never shared that with me. He had always been quiet about business matters. But something like this? I was certain he would have mentioned it. Kate, ever composed, stepped in. I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to talk about the company later. Right now, we need to grieve. Michael's expression tightened just slightly. Actually, there are some matters that can't wait. I've scheduled a family meeting at the house after the reception. The lawyers will be joining us. After the burial, people gathered at my father's large Victorian home on Lake Urive. It was the house Kate and I had grown up in. It was filled with visitors now, sharing catered food, telling stories, laughing quietly through their grief. I drifted from room to room, numb, trying to grasp the reality that Dad was truly gone. Rachel, a familiar voice said, gently stopping me. I turned to see Martin Chen, my father's longtime friend and the architect who had inspired my career. Martin, I said, embracing him, I'm so glad you came. I wouldn't be anywhere else. He said, Jonathan was proud of you. He never stopped talking about your firm in Chicago and the awards you've won. I smiled through my tears. We were working on a project together. Actually, a community center downtown. Dad was providing the land and funding. I was designing it. Martin raised his eyebrows. Really? He never mentioned it to me. It was supposed to be quiet until we finalized things. I said. He called it his legacy project, affordable housing. A clinic. Community space. We planned to break ground next spring. Before Martin could say more, Michael called from across the hallway. The family meeting was starting. I entered the study to find Kate already seated across from Dad's enormous oak desk. Michael had taken Dad's chair. His wife beside him. Two men in suits stood near the bookshelves, presumably the lawyers. Now that we're all here, Michael began, we can address a few urgent matters. As you know, Jonathan was the sole owner of Barrett Construction and its subsidiaries. With his sudden passing, we need to make quick decisions to ensure continuity. One of the lawyers stepped forward. I'm James Wilson, corporate counsel for Barrett Construction. In the absence of a formally executed will. What do you mean absence of a will? I interrupted. Dad updated his will every few years. Michael cleared his throat. There was an unfortunate incident. Jonathan had the will out for review. There was a fire in the fireplace. A draft caught some papers. The will was destroyed. My breath caught. No backups? Not with your office or Dad's lawyer? Your father preferred privacy, Wilson said. He kept the original in his safe. Kate frowned. This doesn't sound like Dad. He was detail obsessed, especially with legal documents. Grief can cloud memory. Michael said smoothly. What matters is keeping the business running. As the senior executive and closest male relative, I'm prepared to serve as acting CEO. The second lawyer handed us folders. These documents grant Michael interim authority over all family and company assets. I skimmed the papers, my stomach turning. Signing them would give Michael total control over everything. And if we don't sign? Kate asked. Michael smiled tightly. Then the company risks stalling. Your inheritance may suffer. We need time, I said firmly, to review this with our lawyers. Of course, Michael replied, still smiling. Just don't delay too long. I glanced at Kate. Her eyes told me she was thinking the same thing I was. Something wasn't right.